It's a stormy night, and in a hostel, a youthful couple lays in bed holding hands as they take a new illegal drug called synchronic. While they stay for the fun goods to start, the man leaves the room and takes the elevator, and in only a few seconds, they both start seeing effects. In the bed, the woman watches how shrubs and shops appear in the room before the walls fade down and an ethnic man appears as well. Now the woman finds herself in the middle of a thick jungle, and as the man comes closer, she notices a snake coming toward her too, making her laugh. In the elevator, the man sees the walls disintegrating and a desert wasteland appearing in front of him. When the elevator bottom suddenly disappears, the man finds himself falling onto the beach. Meanwhile, in the cities, stylish musketeers Steve and Dennis are working as emergency paramedics. Tonight they respond to a call about a case of overdose and go to a house where they find two people on the bottom. A neighbor who says she heard weird noises and someone talking in French. Dennis tends to a bleeding man who's still alive, discovering a bleeding exit crack on his back. Steve tends to the overdose victim and accidentally gets gouged by a hype before he injects the girl with drugs, making her wake up. The police soon arrive and find a wrapper for synchronic, concluding that this is simply a result of addicts attacking each other. On their way out, Steve sees a bobby coin on the bottom and picks it up. While the brace takes the bleeding man to the ambulance, the bobbies find a bloody brand stuck to a wall. Eventually, Steve and Dennis take a break, during which Steve plays golf. He also examines the coin he set up and sees that the stamp date is 1721, which he finds curious. Upset about the borough, Steve has recently had himself checked for HIV, and the croaker recommends that Steve go through a complete medical scan. The following day, Steve goes to his friend's family fun and games to celebrate Dennis's son's birthday. Steve sees Dennis' eldest son, Brianna, sitting alone on a boulder and decides to approach her, knowing that Brianna sees him as the cool uncle. Brianna tries to tell Steve about what she's presently going through, but she's intruded by Steve's phone call. That night at work, Dennis and Steve make their way to the rearmost exigency, which includes notoriety for having burned to death. The officers inform them that they are doubtful how the victim failed, because they saw no other signs of fire. They did find an empty synchronic wrapper as well as an out-of-place doorknob that had melted. Sometime later, Steve gets a brain checkup at the sanitarium and discovers he has an excrescence, which leaves him shaken. Consequently, Dennis and Steve go to their next case, which turns out to be the couple at the hostel. The woman has a snake snout, on her knee, and is in a state of shock, only speaking to murmur her swain's name. They find another synchronic packet at the scene, and the beast control worker tells them they've searched for the snake to no avail. He also tells them that he recognizes the snake, and that it could have only come from a snake that hasn't been seen in the area for decades. Also, Steve finds a bag from the shop where the victim got the synchronic. At that moment, the hostel caretaker tells them he heard a loud bang from the elevator shaft. So Dennis goes to probe. When he opens the elevator doors, he finds the woman's servant at the bottom of the shaft, dead but still looking happy about it. On their way to the sanitarium, Dennis notices Steve taking drugs more frequently. Steve meets with his croaker, who tells him that the excrescence is cancerous and affects his pineal gland. There aren't exact figures. Steve may have 6 weeks left or several decades. It depends on how he reacts to the drug and remedy. Later, Steve considers telling Dennis the news but decides against it. Dennis plays basketball with Brianna, trying to connect with her. He's upset that he may have come a little distant as a father, but Brianna tells him that she's not going through anything terrible. She's just bothered that she still doesn't know what to do with her life. In the evening, Dennis meets Steve at the bar and gifts him a beacon for his birthday. Also, Dennis opens up about the doubts he has about his marriage, confessing that he is doubtful if being a family man is what he wants. He looks at Steve's life as a bachelorette and cannot help but feel jealous occasionally. Dennis chooses that moment to eventually defy Steve about all the drugs he has been taking, upset that Steve may have a dependence, but Steve doesn't tell him about the excrescence. He just says he can take care of himself. The next day, the brace arrives at a house party after another call about an overdose, and they find two teenagers. One is dead on the bottom, and the other is speaking incoherently. They ask her if there are others, and she says a girl named Brianna was with them. Alarmed to hear his son's name, Dennis calls his woman and learns that Brianna is not at home, attesting that it's his son who has gone missing. Now that a loved bone has fallen victim to synchronic, Steve decides to visit the shop that sells it and buy all the remaining packets. A man sees all this and follows Steve to his car to offer to buy the synchronic from him, indeed offering much more than the store's price. Still, Steve tells the man off and drives down. At Dennis' house, he and his woman are reaching the authorities and publishing pamphlets for Brianna. The woman is devastated, always allowing they are not doing enough. That night, Steve is lying in bed with his canine hawking when he suddenly hears a noise coming from the living room. Taking a club with him, he goes to probe, and when he opens the closet, he finds the man from the shop. Steve threatens to beat him, but the man confesses he was the Bone, who made Synchronic. His name is Dr. Kermani. He works as a druggist, and he has been trying to buy back the Synchronic that's being vended all over the country. His job consists of making synthetic opioids by changing the molecular structure of legal substances and turning them into commodities that mimic illegal substances. Synchronic was supposed to be a simple way to have fun, but he accidentally made a commodity that allows people to travel through time. Supposedly, synchronicity distorts the fabric of space-time, allowing people to cross into different ages. Because it impacts a person's pineal gland, grown-ups with a developed pineal gland can only appear as murk or ghosts in history, but youngish people with an underdeveloped pineal gland can travel entirely and indeed get stuck in a different time. Kermani has been spending his time tracking down all the Synchronic to destroy it, and the shop had been his final stop. Skeptical, Steve tells him that he flushed the Synchronic down the restroom and orders Kermani to leave. Believing all Synchronic had been excluded, Kermani leaves, but it's also revealed that Steve didn't flush the Synchronic. He actually only threw them in the trash. The following day, Steve is at his chemotherapy session, and as soon as he finishes, he incontinently feels the side effects and starts puking aimlessly. While he works, Steve is exhausted all the time. Suddenly, Dennis gets a call from the sanitarium, informing him there's a missing dose of morphine. He incontinently suspects Steve because he still doesn't know about the excrescence and has noticed changes in Steve's health. Soon, they get another call about a man with a broken leg, and when they arrive at the scene, they discover the victim speaks a different language. They still start treating the man, and Dennis begins giving Steve instructions. This annoys Steve, and he says he knows how to do his job, but Dennis replies he doesn't, inferring Steve came to work after consuming morphine. As they head out, they get into an argument that starts with many cuts but soon escalates into throwing fists at each other, so the ambulance motorist has to break them piecemeal. Steve leaves, going home alone. Later that night, Steve examines the coin he got from the crime scene, and the sight of the date convinces him to try Synchronic. Only a few twinkles need to pass before bright lights begin filling the living room, and when he turns, he sees a marsh sluggishly appearing around him as his living room walls vanish. Ultimately, the living room disappears fully, and Steve is left in a swamp. He looks around, smelling and touching everything, slightly believing what he's seeing. There's a man stalking him from a distance, murmuring a prayer, but Steve's attention is on a crocodile suddenly approaching him. He backs as he notices he's also starting to vanish, and at that moment the snooper is revealed to be a Spanish conquistador. The man starts charging at Steve with his brand, who doesn't know what to do because he's caught between the crocodile and a crazy dude. But just when the Spaniard is bringing his brand down on him, Steve appears back in his living room, chancing peddling and gaping at him, veritably confused. Steve nearly dismisses what happened as a dream until he sees a rent mark on the bottom from the conquistador's brand. Chancing all this fascination, Steve decides to document his experience with a videotape camera, explaining that Synchronic allows him to go back in time for 7 twinkles and that he suspects that the same happened to Brianna. He takes another cure and sluggishly disappears. He also shows up in the middle of a frozen wasteland, meaning he incontinently starts indurating. Steve notices a figure approaching him, but at that moment he collapses from the cold wave. 7 twinkles pass, and Steve incontinently reappears in his living room, still shivering. He comes to the conclusion that the time period he gets to visit is dependent on his position in the living room, so he tries again in the same spot. This time, he puts on a fleece and carries some wood. When he shows up at the frozen geography, he manages to start a fire and watches the figure approaching him and pointing a shaft. When the person is close enough, Steve eventually sees that he's a troglodyte. He touches the troglodyte's shaft, and once the troglodyte lowers it, Steve offers him a seat. The men sit across from each other for a moment while the 7 twinkles pass, and Steve sluggishly returns to the present. The following morning, Dennis and his wife are having further trouble with their marriage because Brianna's exposure has made their formerly bad problems worse. Meanwhile, Steve hears from the radio that Dr. Kermani has ended his effects for himself. Later that night, Steve thinks about the fact that the paramedics set up the bobby, coin, the brand, and the doorknob in the houses they visited, meaning he should be suitable to carry effects too. Deciding to trial, he takes another Synchronic, and as he starts fading, he embraces hawking. He successfully brings peddling back with him, but unfortunately, they've arrived at a period where the majority of the population is incredibly racist. They've popped up in a house where a man chases them out, so Steve and Hawking run down, only to find everyone in the city looking at them in the same way. 7 twinkles pass, but to Steve's shock, he does not vanish. He decides to return to the house where he and peddling appeared, taking another synchronic before sneaking outside. Sorely, the man discovers them and calls his musketeers, who appear in veritably ignominious white drapes. Chaos ensues in the living room, and Steve gets separated from Hawking. As Steve tries to grasp Hawking's leash, the men are about to shoot Steve, but suddenly he reappears in his living room without peddling. At that moment, Steve hears peddling mewling and runs to the window, only to see peddling sluggishly fading away. This incident helps Steve reach 2 conclusions. If 7 twinkles go by and you aren't at the place where you first appeared, you will be stuck in history, and he needs to snare the object he wants properly, because he only brought back Hawking's leash. The worst part is that he can no longer recoup Hawking because he doesn't have enough synchronic left. Consequently, Steve decides to go to the university dorms where Brianna went missing. Before, one of the teenagers in the incident said Brianna was seen sitting at a spot before fading, and Steve tries to travel at that exact position. He ends up in the middle of a forest, where several men conduct a ritual and mistake him for a spirit they have summoned. They incontinently swarm him, and Steve begins running down in the direction he came from. Fortunately, he's suitable to snare a field president, and gets transported back to the present with no issues. At that moment, a teen who told him about Brianna shows up and clarifies that Brianna had wandered off. She didn't actually vanish from that specific spot. Eventually, Steve meets with Dennis at a bar, and Dennis confesses that he may be getting a divorce. He feels shamed about not fulfilling the pledge he made to his wife on their marriage day and explains that she's loved him unconditionally, but he doesn't suppose he has been returning the love. He says that Brianna was the only one keeping their marriage together, and now that she's gone, he feels that nothing is holding them together. Steve also reveals that he would change his bachelorette life for Dennis's stable married life in a twinkle.